I was involved when I did my PhD in a great, big, large, whatever, research project on dropout and theory-practice relations. And there was made some statistics, and this project made even more statistics, saying that students with difficulties of relating theory and practice would tend more to drop out. So the biggest problem for colleges like the one we're in right now is that there are bad relations between theory and practice. So, and the statistics proved this amongst other factors that would cause dropout. And then the project started a qualitative part project, which I was involved in. And we investigated these different kind of study programs. Are there any differences between theory and practice, and where these differences are, why do they cause all this dropout? But unfortunately, we didn't find that much of a gap between theory and practice. And we organized the field work in such a way that we studied colleges where there was an enormous dropout rate and a very little dropout rate. And we couldn't tell the difference. We're not told when we did the research, when we did the field work, which one of the campuses held the highest dropout rate. So we needed to find out ourselves by looking at these cultural practices that they had. What do they do? What is the environment? How do they act out their teaching? How do they plan their study programs and evaluate it? We didn't identify. We couldn't tell which one of them has the highest dropout rates. What we found was that there was a great variety in how theory was perceived, how practice was received, and how this was related. An enormous variety. And this inspired us to say that let's try and make a theory and practice teaching method, or theory and practice didactics, where we try to acknowledge the differences and we try to transgress the cultural boundaries that we've perceived. Because what we saw is that some of these study programs were very much, when we look at the whole of the study programs, were very much into one kind of theory and practice relations, and another was into another kind. And there were even differences between how to perceive theory and practice relations at campus in contrast to the internship. And there were contrasts between how the students, the lecturers, and the mentors viewed the theory and practice. So this is what I call a theory of practice didactics that wishes to transgress these cultural boundaries. And this is how I will end this small lecture for the day. Now, what we started with was, we started a research project on theory and practice and dropout rate. And we more or less thought that, okay, well, it's a matter of comprehending what kind of theory is it that we find in these study programs. We study nursing, nursery teachers, what are they? Pedagogues. Social education.
BA of social education.
Yeah, okay, so it's BA of nursing, BA of social education, BA of teaching, and BA of engineering. And we were studying all these 4 study programs at 8 different colleges. And we more or less thought to ourselves, well, it's a matter of grasping what is theory, what is practice, and how can we sort of say they try to bridge these positions in different ways, and we will sum up the best way to bridge the theory and practice. That would be the end, we thought. But what came to our attention very soon was that this is a picture showing diversity, that there was an enormous diversity. And one of the diversities that we saw was that sometimes theory and practice were carried through in a way that it would not make any sense to make a bridge. So bridging would somehow be useless. It would be stupid. It would be out of the question. It would not make any difference to make a bridge. And in some parts of what we studied, there would be no arguing for making a bridge because theory and practice were already integrated like this. So this picture I have above of bridging soon became sort of a bad metaphor. A metaphor for only designating parts of the relationships between theory and practice, because we saw several others. And this is why I have the picture underneath saying we more or less saw diversity in a much larger degree. I wish to put in the theory and practice problem that we've discussed for these 2,500 years into the bachelor education context, or the professional bachelor context. And in Denmark, it goes something like this. The bachelor programs are not only educating for teachers to become professional teachers in primary school, they are also educating the students for the university. So when I'm a teacher and I've finished with my teacher training college, I can go up to be a professional teacher, but I can also, hey, I want to study further on the university and take a master's degree. So all the studies program have these two program profiles at the same time. And this will strike anyone who will teach at the teacher training program with some kind of dilemmas. What is more preferable? To know how to handle kids or to know how to read different difficult books? You see the difference? There's an enormous difference. What do you want with your career? So all these bachelor programs are in this dilemma, where to put focus. And it becomes worse somehow. At the bachelor programs, all students shift, but they shift alone, they themselves individually, between the campus and the internship. The lecturers do not follow them, and the mentors do not follow them back when they return to campus. They travel themselves alone. So who is bridging, if we can speak of bridging? Who is bridging campus, internship? Students are. And students do it by themselves, alone. Would it not be easy to try and sketch out why misunderstandings occur? Because all the experts are either at campus or either at internship. And those who know how to bridge it are not bridging it. They are separate ways. So those who need to bridge it, but cannot, are forced to somehow interpret the relations between campus and internship. So why do misunderstandings occur? Because they are unexperienced, right? It's so obvious once you've seen it, but these structural ways of organizing education in the Danish system provides that. So that's part of the problem. Another problem, and this is the context of theory and practice in another perspective, is that theory and practice are knowledge forms. It's a knowledge to have theory, it's a knowledge to have practice. But why are we only speaking of the knowledge forms theory and practice? There are other kinds of ways of speaking of theory and practice. For 2,500 years ago lived a guy called Aristotle. He did not speak of theory and practice as the only ways of speaking of knowledge forms. He rather spoke of a numerous ways of integrating theory and practice. So theory and practice was integrated in technique when you were producing something. Theory and practice were integrated in dialogue, in phronesis, when you were arguing for something. Theory and practice were integrated in episteme, when you were analyzing something, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. And all these knowledge forms were not designated for either theory or practice. All these knowledge forms integrated theory and practice, but were designated for different kind of purposes. So this is another more elaborated, more nuanced way of speaking of what knowledge forms are relevant. But the cultural context that we are in right now are only speaking of two forms of knowing something, theory and practice. So how to sort of articulate what our study programs are all about are using words that themselves are constructing problems by only having theory and practice.
So what you're saying is that our mind and our culture and the way we communicate here divides theory and culture, and it's not really divided
Theory and practice.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Theory and practice.
That's true. It makes sometimes the gaps themselves, even though they don't need to be there don't need to be a gap. But I must admit that Aristotle was somehow he himself who started this debate and making these misunderstandings. I mean, using an interpretation of Aristotle, saying that it doesn't need to be that way. But it's striking once you've seen it that the discourse of talking about study programs holds these two kind of knowledge forms, and these knowledge forms are separate from each other, or somehow otherwise interrelated. When you look at how the government wants study programs like the professional bachelor study programs in Denmark related, we will see that they speak of a very visible and close relations between theory and practice through teaching and internships. So it is intended that theory and practice, campus and internship are very much related. It's a matter of two sides of the same coin, you could say in Danish. They are not separate from one another. But as I told you, we make these statistics on the dropout rate and difficulties of theory and practice, and then came on the qualitative part of the study, of the research. And we visit all these study programs, all these colleges, and what is going on in the daily life. What happens if we study, if we make research on these study programs as a whole. And what happened was that we saw that theory and practice is not just something that is a part of like any abstract grammatical sentence or mathematical sentence, something that is isolated from the context. No, theory and practice is an integrated part of the context. So theory and practice are not just knowledge forms, it's practical forms too. And I will get back to that. But what we saw that we were studying the Bachelor for Engineering, Bachelor for Social Worker, here I call it Nursery Teacher, but it's the same. Bachelor of Nursing and Bachelor of Education, that's the teachers. And we that's the same?
No, it's the nursery teacher is social education and not social work. But
okay, social educator.
Yeah, social
okay.
educator. Yeah.
Thank you. The engineers, they had a very strong professional identity. They were very much focused on efficiency, on the top-down hierarchy. They were designated for the private labor market. They had a very instrumental knowledge form. They were very product-oriented. They were analyzing by testing a thesis. So here is a particular way of looking at the relationships of theory and practice, which I will get back to. But imagine. Now we have these, I keep forgetting what we call it.
BA in social education.
Social education, yeah. What we saw in Denmark, I don't know if it's the same in Serbia, what we saw in Denmark is that we saw a very weak professional identity. Not that is bad or they're doing something that is crazy or something, but they were not very sure of themselves. They had a very clear focus on human values, democratic relations. They were designated for the public labor market. Personal relations were of very high value. They were very process-oriented, and it was an education and internship shaped by practice and dialogue-based educational forms. Now the nurses, they had a very strong professional identity, but it was also a top-down hierarchy, but with a focus on emphasis on human values and designated for the public labor market. The teachers had also a strong professional identity. They focused on both efficiency and human values, and they had very great emphasis on democratic relations amongst the teachers' pupils, and they were designated for the public labor market. So this is trying to view these different study programs as a whole, where theory and practice relations are not something that you just can put in like something that's isolated, but that this wholeness of the study programs will shape how theory and practice are then related. And this comes up to something like this. For the engineers, theory and practice are instruments for making a better product. So you can bridge theory and practice through testing. For the nursery teacher, I keep forgetting it, theory and practice are not separated. They are integrated. And that is because what is of greater purpose for the nursery teacher is not to be very theoretical or very practical, but to be ethical. So how can you take care of kids or anyone who needs help? Theoretically, practical? Wouldn't it better to do it ethical? And that is what strikes these people very obvious too. So this is what signifies their professional identity more. Nurses, they are very much like teachers. Theory and practice are bridged through testing, but also undivided through ethical objectives. So here we have a combination of what you can say, what is engineers bridge the theory and practice through testing. The nursery teachers, they not separate, but the nurses and the teachers are combinations of these two somehow. And this makes a contrast inside of both the education for nurses and for teachers. And this is also very interesting, that the study programs do not necessarily contain some homogenic agreeing cultural whole where everybody feels the same. No, there are very great contrasts inside, especially the Bachelor for Nursing and the Bachelor for Teachers for Education. And what this sums up to, when you look at theory-practice relations as a whole, is that we did not necessarily identify a gap between theory and practice. This was not was striking us the most. And this is very sort of surprising, because the statistics that were made started out exactly from the point where there was a gap between theory and practice that needed to be bridged. But when we did our field work, we did not necessarily see that need for any bridge. Theory and practice were very much related on a daily basis. This was not necessarily because in a ways that people sort of knew about it, they were articulating it, but let me give you an example. In another part of the project, teachers from the nursery education observed teachers from the social education. And the teachers at the social education did not think of their teaching as being very theoretical. They were sort of, oh, I'm sorry, this is not very theoretical, you won't get anything out of it. But the nurses from the teacher education, when they observed it, they found a whole lot of theory. This is sort of thick of theory. What you're able to do, that must contain, I don't know, you must have read thousands of books, because this is so elaborated, you're so well informed about what it means to be a good childcare. So it's a matter of the perspectives of what is actually going on at the educations. So what we saw instead was that it was not the gap between theory and practice that was very clear. No, it was the different ways of looking at how theory and practice was related. Either as something you can bridge, or either as something you don't need to bridge, to say it roughly. And then it struck us that we need to speak of a more elaborate way of looking at theory and practice. Theory and practice cannot only be looked at something we call knowledge forms. That means ways of knowing, acting, making, and analyzing and such. Theory and practice also needs to be looked at something that we could call a practice. Here I spell it with an X, like the Greek. And what I intend by this is to emphasize the cultural or the ethnological or anthropological ways of understanding how theory and practice is a part of a culture. So practice means common ways of arguing, justifying daily actions, reflections, going about one another. This is what practice sort of means. And what we saw then was that all study programs, every campus, all lectures, students, internships, internship mentors, had cultural reasons for particular intentions of relating theory and practice. So one study program saw this way of relating theory and practice, and another saw another way of relating, and so on and so on. And these cultural forms of practice are very obvious from the inside. And it can become so obvious that it's difficult to see that this could be seen as in any other way. And the little task I gave you in the beginning was actually about that. It can be so obvious that it's difficult to see that this could be any different. But what's so obvious from the inside could be very difficult to see from the outside. Because it's so integrated, it's so normal. It's so much of course. In Danish we have a word for it. It's called selvfølgeligheder. In English that would be something like of courseness. The of courseness of theory and practice are so integrated.
Could we call it a cultural truth, maybe? That
You could call it a cultural truth.
Everybody here in this room has accepted as a cultural truth that there is a bridge between theory and practice.
Yeah. Or then there's a need for a bridge. Yeah. But
Sorry, a gap. Sorry, yeah.
or a gap, yes.
Yeah.
So practice strives for recognition, for their particular understanding of the relationships between theory and practice. So whatever I do in my daily practice, when I meet somebody who thinks different, I will strive for his recognition for the way I understand theory and practice. So I will argue with him. I will perhaps even hurt him, perhaps verbal ways, for him to recognize I have the best understanding of how theory and practice are related. And we made a model. We called it the Tempus-Logos model. Tempus saying something about place, saying something about the context, history, the site where we are at. And since students travel between campus and internship, we put these two in the Tempus. And what do? They integrate, or they work, articulate, argue from a logos perspective. That means they work with these two knowledge forms, theory and practice. Now what we did was that you can use this model by saying, how does the student travel between these parts, or how do the student relate the campus and the internship, and in that relation combines theory and practice? Well, that could make some kind of analysis. What is of great importance is that you see that theory is not only at campus and practice is not only at internship. No. Theory and practice can both be at campus, and theory and practice can both be at internship. So the particular way that the student will perceive how theory and practice are related, either at campus or internship, that will be one analysis. And we can relate that to another student. And then we can take out the student in the middle and we can see how does the lecturer actually think of the relationships between campus and internship. And how does the lecturer go about teaching theory and practice. And then we have that one out. And we put the internship mentor in the middle and say, how does the mentor, he starts at the internship, but how does he think of the relationship between campus and internship? And how does he think of the relationship between theory and practice? And then we could take out, now we have individuals, we could take that out and let's put in the bill for what these bachelor programs should be like. What are the political intentions? We can put that inside. And then we can analyze it. How does it combine? How does it wish to combine the campus and the internship? How does it wish to combine theory and practice? And then we will see that there are many different cultural perceptions of how theory and practice are related. And this sums up to a model like this that we have stolen or copied from an American philosopher called Estelle R. Jorgensen. And she speaks, and we in our project do the same, of 4 kinds of relating theory and practice. And these are developed out of philosophical ways of understanding how theory and practice could be related. So what we have here in the first line is dichotomy. Now the boundaries between theory and practice are very hard when you look at theory and practice relations from the dichotomy position. What we have, if we look at it in perspective on ontology, we have dualism. And what we do is that we describe. We describe this is this is that, this is theory, this is practice. Now, would it be needed for a bridge in this perspective? No. If we make a bridge in this perspective, either theory or practice dissolves. Because theory and practice are different. That is the whole point in this perspective. If they're bridge, they dissolve. So there is no bridging. And that's the point. And that's okay. I'm not saying either of these positions are better or worse. I'm saying that these are the positions you can do when you look at it philosophically. Now you can also look at a relationship between theory and practice from a polarity perspective. Now you have more soft boundaries. It's made up of polarity. Here we have theory, here we have practice, and they can move to each other. It's also descriptive. Now what does it mean that theory and practice move towards one another? It means that we make tests. It means that we once in a while make tests. Does this hypothesis come true? Yes, then we have a relationship between theory and practice. So this is what we sometimes see when we speak of effective schools or evidence, school-based evidence for school-based, or what do you call it? Yeah.
What, school-based evidence?
No, I mean evidence-based schooling. What's of greater evidence for teaching this kind of method? What is the most efficient way of teaching? This is very common in
practice evidence.
Best practice. Thank you.
Practice evidence, yeah.
Best practice evidence. This is very common in Danish discourse at the moment. But this is looking at theory and practice from a polarity perspective. Now this is what we saw when we saw the engineers that were testing their ideas, right? But what we saw with the social workers or the educational, keep forgetting it, nursery teachers.
Nursery teachers.
Yeah, was that they had a fusion between theory and practice. And the fusion between theory and practice means that if we separate it and put an emphasis on theory, then we will have instrumentalism in this perspective. Then theory will just be something that, oh, you need to do what the theory guides you to. Okay, if then we've put the emphasis on practice, no, that's not good either. Anyway, then we will turn into activism. Uninformed activism that will be guided by any kind of wind going through the room. So what we need is an integration of theory and practice, and not any kind of separation.